like me, you are a fan of Gothic fiction, then you'll know that one of the unofficial staples of the genre is a woman called the Governess. Gothic fiction has a lot of tropes that define it, and the Governess isn't really one of them, and yet she is so often there. Several great classic works of Gothic fiction feature a governess character, and many modern Gothic historical novels also feature governesses, often as their protagonists, almost as a dedication, a love letter to the history of Gothic fiction. So let's talk about the legacy of the governess in historical fiction through 5 fantastic Gothic novels. 2 are classics that define the genre, define the governess as a character, and 3 are brand new historical Gothic novels that I really love and admire. Let's jump in. Now, as you may or may not know, the novel that started all of this off was Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. Jane Eyre as a work of art is a curious thing. It sits kind of uncomfortably on a line between romantic and Gothic fiction. If you want more of my thoughts on Gothic versus romantic fiction, by the way, I've got a bunch of videos on the topic. And Jane Eyre is weird in that respect, especially when compared to the superior Wuthering Heights by Charlotte Bronte's younger sister, Emily. And while I'm here, huge respect to the often overlooked Anne Bronte. The Tenant of Wildfell Hall is fantastic. I've got a video on this as well. Anywho, Jane Eyre put the governess on the map as a Gothic protagonist, an icon of Gothic fiction. In this novel, the governess is Jane Eyre herself. We begin the novel in her earliest years as a child, and then going into school, and eventually, when she reaches her young adulthood, she takes a job as a governess. And I suddenly realise at this point that I haven't actually defined what a governess is. During, but also a bit before and a bit after the Victorian period, the governess was a job given exclusively to women who were relatively well educated, and the job involved them living and working in a stately home, a house owned by a rich, well-to-do guy, often a businessman or a lord, and her job would be to educate the children of the house, to be their live-in teacher. The governess is kind of the successor to the nanny. A nanny raises kids for a while, and then when they're ready to be schooled, the governess moves in and takes charge of the kids and their education. And that's Jane Eyre's role at Thornfield Hall. When she arrives, she is put in charge of this young French girl, and soon enough she meets the master of the house, an awkward and strange man called Rochester. The relationship between Jane Eyre and Rochester is iconic at this point, but in case you've never read Jane Eyre, I'm not going to spoil it, even though it's nearly 200 years old. While Jane is working at Thornfield Hall as the governess and she's getting to know Rochester a little bit better, she starts to notice that there are strange happenings and goings-on at Thornfield Hall. She wonders if it's haunted. She's hearing laughter and footsteps at night, even though she knows everybody who lives and works there. There is some other presence in this house, and eventually there will be a fire. And from that fire come revelations. And I won't tell you any more. Jane Eyre is a good book. It has its flaws, it has its issues, and it's not as good as Wuthering Heights. But it is the reason the governess exists as an iconic Gothic protagonist. And almost exactly 50 years after Jane Eyre, we got Henry James's The Turn of the Screw, a Gothic horror novella. The Turn of the Screw is also a pretty iconic story. It's a lot shorter than Jane Eyre, and it was fairly recently the subject matter to Mike Flanagan's Netflix series The Haunting of Bly Manor, which is really, really good. Even though I am a fan of The Turn of the Screw, one annoying and kind of weak element for me is the very clumsy framing device. When the story opens, we have a narrator who passes the story on to a man who reads us a manuscript from his sister, who was once a child put in charge of a man who was not her father but rather her uncle, who hired a woman who became the protagonist of the story, who is in fact our governess. It is ludicrously convoluted. It pisses me off so badly. How far removed did Henry James have to get from the idea of a female protagonist and narrator? We had to have a man telling the story of a man telling the story of a woman telling the story of a man telling the story of a woman. It is so frustrating. In spite of all that, Turn of the Screw is real good. And unlike Jane Eyre, it is a work of Gothic horror fiction. As I said, Jane Eyre sits on that edge between romantic and Gothic, but The Turn of the Screw is just all-out Gothic horror. And our nameless protagonist is a governess who moves into Bly Manor in Essex. There, she is in charge of the education of a young girl, but this girl also has a brother who's at boarding school, and very early on, he gets kicked out of that boarding school. Now, in Jane Eyre, Jane hears noises, and eventually those noises and the secrets surrounding them get revealed. Likewise, in The Turn of the Screw, there is a presence, a pair of presences in this house. The ghosts of a woman and a man, and we have to wonder if they are in fact ghosts, and if they are, who are they the ghosts of? The children know these ghosts, knew the people, but again, I don't want to go into spoilers in case you haven't read it, and even though it's 126 years old, it's still worth reading and learning and discovering all this stuff yourself. I also recommend you watch The Haunting of Bly Manor, although it is pretty different from The Turn of the Screw. But Jane Eyre and The Turn of the Screw have the governess in common, as well as the fact that the governess in both stories is stumbling into a new world, a big, antique, lofty, overly large house, full of shadowy corners, and so many mysteries, locked rooms, attic spaces, expansive grounds with a forest at one edge and a lake at the other. These old stately homes are microcosms, dark spaces, echoey chambers, surrounded by landscapes of their own, all of it private land and therefore curated and yet kind of empty, underpopulated. The governess walks into this house. She doesn't understand it. She's got a job to do. She gets to know the kids, and the kids, well, they're children. They tell truths. They spread mischief. They disobey. They go missing. They go exploring. They do things they shouldn't do. They provide you with too much honesty and also too many lies. That's how kids are, and that's the interesting role of the governess, as someone who is so close to and connected to and in charge of the children of the house. But the children, as a conduit for secrecy and mystery, are confusing things, because they're kids. The truths and lies that they tell are confusing, and The Turn of the Screw in particular really leans into that. And of course, in these stories, the house itself is a character, and the governess has to try to wrangle with that character. She has to get to know it, understand it, sometimes even fight against it. The house can be a villain, and the governess a kind of hero. Such is the case, arguably, in these two books. And now let's move on to some modern historical novels that show an intense love for the governess as a character. This is The Puzzlewood, the second novel by Rosie Andrews. I was a huge fan of Rosie Andrews' debut novel, The Leviathan. This is a ridiculously campy, fairy tale infused work of Gothic horror. I adore this book. I devoured this thing in like 2 days, and I was obsessed with the language of it. Camp is the word I want to use over and over again. It is so campy, it is so ridiculous. It is theatrical, it is provocative, it is over the top. This is a novel having so much fun with Gothic tropes in a very cartoonish, exciting, adventurous way. I was obsessed with this book, and it did not get enough attention. Frustratingly, I don't think The Puzzlewood is as good as The Leviathan, but once again, Rosie Andrews demonstrates a love for the Gothic, a deft hand at writing great historical fiction, and a mastery of mystery and suspense. Weirdly for me, The Puzzlewood is set in my home county where I grew up, and I have a very, very difficult personal relationship with where I grew up. Going back is always a struggle, and reading the names of places that I knew as a kid over and over again in this book added a sense of unease to the whole thing for me, which means that this book unsettled me on two levels. One, as a piece of fiction, and two, as something that I awkwardly related to. The titular Puzzlewood is a place that really exists. It is a protected piece of ancient English forest. We're talking thousands of years old. The trees in this forest are gnarled and very fairy tale looking. Imagine a fairy tale forest. Just close your eyes and picture a dark, Sleeping Beauty-esque fairy tale forest. That's Puzzlewood, and it is also often used for that exact reason in Hollywood movies. There are plenty of films that have been made in Puzzlewood, including Star Wars. It gets used all the time for filming. I've explored it, it's a beautiful place, and it is the setting of this novel. The book follows a woman who has called herself Catherine Simmons. The reason I say that is because she's the new governess of a house at the edge of the Puzzlewood, at the foot of the Black Mountains on the border between England and Wales, again, where I come from. But she knows more about this house than she's letting on, at least a little bit more. She has an express purpose for being there. Her younger sister, from whom she was estranged many years ago, was the governess of this house until very recently. The book opens with a series of back and forth letters between Catherine's husband, who also died during all of this, and the lawyer of the owner of the house. Catherine's sister Emily died in the Puzzlewood. Early on, we're given an idea of what happened, the kind of official story, which is that Emily left the house with the child one day to go play in the forest. The girl, Georgie, lost track of Emily. She was wandering around the forest for a while, and when she found Emily again, Emily had hanged herself from the branch of a tree in the Puzzlewood. She went out to play with this kid, and then while they were separated, took her own life. Pretty sus. But because Catherine has just lost her husband, she decides to take the job of the new governess at this house and go find out what happened to her sister. But of course, no one at the house knows that she was related to Emily. Interestingly, this novel also has a second perspective, that of the local doctor, who is very new to doctoring in the area. His grandfather was the local doctor until recently, and the two of them are closely involved in the rights and actions of the local miners. There's a mine nearby, and these two doctors are involved in what the miners are up to. That aspect of the story is important, and yet also kind of feels like a distraction at times. But once again, we have a very enticing mystery, and the Puzzlewood itself is a wonderful setting for dark, terrifying things. In fact, I'm going to read you from like page 5, very, very early on in the book. There's a wonderful exchange between Catherine and the man who is driving her in a pony and trap to the house. Since I grew up there, I'm going to have a go at the accent. Parry fumbled his flask. His hand clamped down on her arm, and she was surprised to see something set deep in his bleary eyes. Something like fear, which gave her pause. "A woman shouldn't go about in these woods alone," he said carefully. For an instant she felt doubt, then shook him off. "It's trees and squirrels, Mr. Parry. You're not suggesting I'll come to harm." "Not harm," he said, more carefully still. "But my mother with the angels would skin me alive if I let a lady go off on her own through those trees. There are legends about the woods," he added. "You don't want to get lost in there." "What legends?" "The woods always been here," he said, repeating his claim from earlier. "It don't belong to us." Lightly she replied, "It belongs to Sir Roland, does it not?" But Parry shook his head and said gruffly, "Bit of paper you can't own." He stopped, seeming more resigned. "Can't expect you to understand not being from here. You've got to have grown up here. You've got to know the wood. But he wouldn't say more. He slumped back in his seat, clutching the reins. Scary stuff. Very theatrical, very, very fun. Check out the Puzzlewood. Another wonderful Gothic governess novel is The Secrets of Hartwood Hall by my friend and fellow YouTuber Katie Lumsden. Katie's lovely, she's wonderful, she's brilliant, and this is her debut novel. The Secrets of Hartwood Hall tells the story of a governess called Margaret. She has just lost her husband, and now she needs to return to work. She used to be a governess before she got married, and so she takes a job at the titular Hartwood Hall. And this house, appropriately, has a lot of secrets. When she arrives, she meets the child that she's now in charge of, a boy called Louis. But Louis is not allowed outside of the house. If he is to go onto the grounds of the house, then Margaret needs to be with him at all times, not let him out of her sight for a second. And he's definitely not ever allowed beyond the grounds. There's a local village, and when Margaret goes to the village and talks to the people, they say that the people who live in the house never venture into the village. Margaret is a good, God-fearing Christian, and she is shocked that Louis and his mother don't attend church on Sundays. And so she sees it as her duty to take Louis to church, which she does so early in the novel, and Louis's mother is not happy. But Margaret is confused as to why these rules are here. Why can't Louis leave the house? What is wrong? What is happening here? The secrets of Hartwood Hall are myriad, and they intertwine so brilliantly. Margaret is frustrated by one secret which leads to another secret, and each of these secrets has a mystery wrapped around it, waiting for Margaret to try and untangle and understand. Hartwood Hall is soaked in secrets. And as you go through the novel, what keeps the pages turning and turning is the fact that secrets lead to more secrets. And it's all wonderfully constructed, brilliantly plotted. It all makes sense and it will all get revealed and be clearly understood by the end. It's a brilliant novel. And it does feel like a love letter to the Governess and her place within Gothic and historical fiction. Once again, this is a woman who ventures into a mysterious home. She is out of her depth. The house is an enormous space with strange people living and working at it, a village nearby, people saying different things from different directions, and she's caught in the middle of it trying to understand things. She has her own ethics and morals and personality. She has a job to do, and because that job is looking after a kid, she feels that she needs to do what's in the boy's best interests, and that sometimes goes against what the mother wants or thinks is good, and then we have a kind of moral battlefield. There's a lot going on here, and it's never too much, it's never unmanageable. There are plenty of secrets and you'll have a lot of fun untangling them one by one, falling deeper into the secrets of Hartwood Hall. And finally we have Fine Shade by Kate Griffin. I actually got to meet Kate last year. She's lovely and she's absolutely f***ing hilarious. And Fine Shade is a true work of Gothic fiction. It tells the story of a woman named Marta, who has just lost her beloved grandmother. Marta's grandmother was French and she was also a cunning woman. A woman in touch with nature, a woman of medicine, a woman of mystery. And after her grandmother dies, Marta accepts a job as a governess at a house called Fine Shade. This house is particularly strange given that it doesn't have an owner or a master. Well, I mean, technically it does. Somebody owns it and he exists, but he's never there. Marta doesn't meet him. She was hired by the staff of the house because there is a child who needs a governess, but that means that the owner, the child's father, doesn't know that she exists. She is living and working and receiving money for doing so at this house without the owner ever knowing she exists, and is educating his child. Not only that, but we learn early on he has another child, a son who is much older than the daughter that she's taking care of. But this son is hated. He's not allowed inside the house. He is forbidden from entering it. He comes and goes, and when he's there, he lives on the grounds in his own little room. Marta eventually gets to talking with him and learning the story of Fine Shade from his perspective. Where is the master? Why is his son barred from entering? And of course, we have a little girl who knows what she knows. She has her own answers and interpretations and memories and things that she can offer up. And Fine Shade is absolutely a Gothic novel that enjoys its setting. Fine Shade is a house of hidden corridors, of secret doorways behind bookcases, that kind of thing. It's a place with veins and organs and things to explore and discover. You can get behind the skin of this house, see what makes up its bones. It feels so alive. And you are existing inside this living thing with Marta, this strange, enigmatic, dark, living place. This enormous beast of stone and wood. Fine Shade, more than any other, is a novel that really excels at creating a character out of the house. And what also sets Marta apart when it comes to the governess stereotype is that she is so willful. She's a courageous and strong woman. She's curious and she's not afraid to get in trouble, to get her hands dirty, to risk so many things to find the truth. She doesn't just behave, she isn't a good little girl. She will get in trouble, she will do what she needs to do in order to find the truth. She is spurred on by her curiosity. There's an edge to her. I love her as a protagonist, and I love the house as a setting. This is a really fun novel. I really hope you've enjoyed this little dive into the history of the Governess as a character in Gothic fiction. And I have a feeling that this is going to carry on. We will get more Gothic historical novels featuring governesses. It's amazing how much fruit this tree bears. It's a very rigid structure. Governess takes job at house. But there are so many stories that can be told with this formula, as I've just proven here. If you love Gothic fiction, these are all must-read books. Subscribe for books.